Good afternoon, everyone. How was everyone's lunch? Good. I feel like we've lost some people, or maybe it's because all of them are on stage. But um, well, I'm so thrilled to be moderating this panel, which I think will be of great interest to everyone in this room, because we're going to really focus now. We've had a wide-ranging conversation over the past day so far, and now we're going to really get down to the money question. It's always an important one, and how to think about fair pay for neighbors. And I think there are many different views on this topic, and many different views on how to get to that goal. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from our amazing panel here. I think first we are going to start from our only remote participant, Taylor Owen. Is that right? His video is going to be queued up. So Taylor is with the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy in Canada, and was intimately involved with the ongoing legislation and the negotiation that happened and the aftermath. For those of you who are not familiar with that process, Canada did try to introduce legislation that would require big tech companies to pay. There was a lot of back and forth. The legislation was passed. Meta, as a result of this, exited the market and blocked news, local news. And then now there's a fund. So let's hear from Taylor.
Hi, everyone. My name's Taylor Owen. I'm a professor at McGill University, where I direct the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy and the Media Ecosystem Observatory. I'm really happy to be here like this. I really wish I was there in person, but thanks so much for letting me at least contribute to this conversation with some of our experiences in Canada over the last couple of years with journalism policy generally, but in specifically with our Online News Act, which is our version of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which came into effect almost a year and a half ago now, and has led to real changes in our information ecosystem, in particular, Meta blocking all links to news in Canada, which they've been doing for, again, almost a year and a half, and which had a profound effect on our information ecosystem. And we've been studying that effect, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we've seen. So first, though, the Online News Act, it, like I said, is a version of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. Instead of using the Competition Authority, though, it uses a regulatory model to enforce and force platforms to enter into financial arrangements with publishers when they make news accessible on their platforms. Interestingly, I didn't use the word link, despite what you might have heard. The word link does not appear once in the bill because it's not about links. It's about facilitating access to news, a point which will become critical a little bit later in the talk. The second thing to note about this is a regulatory model, but also that it responds to a status quo. The status quo was that in Canada, publishers or platforms already had deals with publishers. They were just with some publishers, not all of them, and the terms of the deals were hidden behind NDAs. So they were unaccountable, opaque, and unreliable. They would come and go year to year. So the bill was in part addressing this inequity and this, frankly, in my view, undemocratic distribution of funds from platforms to publishers that pre-existed the bill. Another thing to note here is that Canada also had other journalism policies that we've been experimenting with. We have a labor subsidy, a tax credit for journalism, a tax credit for subscriptions, and we've built a new charitable status category for journalistic entities. So all of these are sort of in the mix as well. This isn't the only thing we were doing. The key thing here, though, is that by doing a regulatory model as opposed to the Australian path, the government gained a huge amount of power to hold the terms of the deals accountable. We could make them transparent and public. We could force regular reporting of them. We could ensure that they were evenly distributed and that the money went to journalism, right? So these what ended up being exemption criteria which are the types of deals that were applicable and allowable under the bill, became the real lever of power for the regulator, and I think the core asset of this approach. So, again, as you would have heard, neither Google nor Meta were particularly thrilled with this policy approach, but they both had very different goals, I think, in how they responded. I think Google's goal was to drive down the cost per capita of the amount they would be liable for in this regulatory model. I think they were concerned, probably rightly, that other countries were going to adopt this model as well. And Canada is a pretty small market. We only have 40 million people. But if this policy were to extend to Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, California, the United Kingdom, all of a sudden the per capita amount becomes a really big deal. And so keep that in mind when I talk a bit about the fund. So the fund they ended up with was $100 million for a country of 40 million people. So I think that gives you a sense of what they find acceptable as a per capita rate to pay to journalism. The tactics they used were unfortunately incredibly divisive. And honestly, the one aspect of this whole debate that upsets me the most is that the platforms chose, or Google in particular, chose to divide the journalism community against each other. Journalism's in a tough enough place in democratic societies right now, but to have fuel thrown on false debates and false divides about link taxes and financial imbalances between small and large publishers, which was just patently false, was really sad to see. So Google, as I said, ended up with this $100 million fund at the end. I'll return to it in a second. Meta's goal was different. I think they were seeking to go nuclear in Canada to dissuade other jurisdictions from even considering this kind of policy. They rejected the premise of the bill and they threatened a full news block. And that is what they did. They did not participate actively in the negotiations and the amendments to the bill. Instead, they held off, and the week after the bill passed, they blocked all access to links in Canada. Now, we study the whole ecosystem in Canada. We collect public posts on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, X, and we pair it with regular national surveys to look at the implications of major changes in the ecosystem, like this one. So here are some of the things we found. The main implication is that Canada has lost 11 million views of journalism a day on Instagram and Facebook. So this is 11 million times that someone, a Canadian, would have come across a piece of journalism on the internet that's now gone. I think we have to ask really seriously what that means to a democratic society when you pull that amount of journalism out of it on a daily basis. We've seen a drop in almost a half of all news media engagement across all platforms. This has had an effect not just on Facebook and Instagram, but on the ecosystem as a whole. A quarter of all news outlets are now inactive on all of social media, almost all of which, 98% of which, are local. This has disproportionately affected local and independent journalism. Perhaps most worryingly, Canadians haven't noticed. A majority of Canadians get their news on Facebook and Instagram, or used to. A majority of the people who say they get their news on Facebook and Instagram still say they do. Think about that. It's now gone. Links to journalism are gone, and yet they still say they get their news on Facebook. So there's a lot going on there that we can get into. And in short, I think people don't necessarily affiliate journalism with news. They see news as information about the world from influencers, from friends and family, so on and so forth, not as journalism. And I think that's something we who study journalism and who practice journalism need to reflect on. But the other reason is that there is still some journalism on Facebook and Instagram. However, it's not links. It is screenshots of news. And remember I said at the beginning, the News Act was not about links. It was about facilitating access. And Meta still is facilitating access. They're just facilitating access to screenshots that are likely violations of copyright of the publishers and are theft. They're people stealing content and posting it on Instagram and Facebook, and arguably makes Facebook or Instagram or sorry Meta subject to the bill again, which is a debate I think we'll be having increasingly in this country. So finally, to wrap this up, like, was this good or bad for journalism? Looking back a year and a half, um, on the con side, Canada's very dependent on platforms and government for the funding of our journalism now, probably overly dependent, and I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think half of funding for journalism should be coming from the two actors that journalism should be most holding accountable in a democratic society. I think the government didn't take into account the disproportionate effects that the meta block, which they should have predicted would happen, would have on different types of publishers. They should have put in place policies to mitigate this disproportionate effect it had on the independent and local publishers who, however foolhardily, were reliant on Facebook and Instagram traffic for their revenue model. On the pro side, anyone who discounts $100 million per year equitably, predictably, and transparently distributed to journalism is, in my view, not taking the crisis facing journalism in democratic societies seriously. This is real money and it's being distributed in, I think, the best possible way. It's transparent, it's predictable, and it's equitably distributed based on an FTE basis of journalism. And this is what a fund should be aspiring to achieve. However, this outcome is only possible if the fund is established under regulation. Google's now saying to other jurisdictions, look, why not just start with a fund and not go through all the mess of a regulated approach or legislative approach like in Canada? We ended up right where we started, offering a fund. But that is not true. They offered a fund that was not transparent, not equitably distributed, and not predictable, and ultimately not accountable. If you want those things, you need to legislate and have a regulatory oversight of the creation and distribution of the fund over time. And that's the lesson of Canada. Finally, we are about to do this all again with generative AI. We're in the exact same place we were 10 years ago with platform funding of journalism, except we have a new range of actors. And I think this regulatory model, however imperfect in Canada, does give us some lessons for how to deal with the next phase of this, which is the deals that look very similar, that are unevenly distributed, not transparent, and hidden from public view, that generative AI firms are making with the very same publishers that have been through this before. So thank you for the time. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I hope to be at least one of the next events in this amazing series this year. And I look forward to hearing about your conversations.
I mean, he's not here, but we should come, right? So really thought-provoking and really an incredible case study of what happens when an intervention is not at halftime, but is sort of the game is, I guess you can't really say it's complete, but we know a little bit more about the aftermath and now it can be studied. I think that our hope is that if there are questions for Taylor, that we should find a way to capture those questions, and then we can make sure that that is conveyed to audiences in the future and to this group as well. I'd like to now turn to our next speaker, who is Anya Schifrin. Anya is one of the people who has been convening globally around this exact topic, around tech and journalism and how to ensure that journalism thrives and survives and thrives amid all this disruption. She's with Columbia University and is the convener of the Saving Journalism Conference that is going to be in its fifth iteration coming up. And I'll pass the floor to you.
Oh, thank you. Everyone's invited, of course. Thank you so much. You know, I got interested in platform compensation during the pandemic when I'd heard that Australia was about to start getting Google and Facebook to pay for news. And I had this class on Zoom and I wanted a project that was encouraging and a solution. And so I asked my students who wants to work with me and find out what they're doing in Australia. And so we spent the fall of 2020 looking at this. And then when it got passed, could I have the slide, please? In spring of 2021, Taylor and I said, you know, we should really start convening. So we contacted Tando's office and many of the European regulators, and we had the first Zoom saying, this is interesting, let's take a look. So as you all know, so I'm going to take stock a little bit of what's happening and where I think we need to go with the Trump election. And I'm so grateful that everyone in this room is so interested in this subject. You know, Courtney early on started talking about it, and Irene and Camille and everyone in this room, and we've been to conferences together and done research together. And so it's just really wonderful to be together. Thank you. So yes, we know now, of course, the bargaining code was enacted in February 2021 in Australia and resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars being transferred to journalism around the world. In many countries, just talking about regulating pushed Google to pay more than they were paying before to journalism, to publishers. So in that sense, it's been successful. But as Taylor mentioned, it has provoked a tremendous backlash as well. And the Google and Meta tactics are the same as the normal US corporate tactics. So they've been hiring a lot of lobbyists. Courtney and I both read this wonderful new book called Careless People, which is by the former head of public policy at Facebook. They commission research all the time. So today we just saw a study from Google showing that no one in Europe really reads news and they're not making any money off it anyway. As Taylor mentioned, around the world, publishers have been pitted against each other. And obviously, Brazil was a case study of a lot of this. We've, in fact, just written a case study about Brazil with a Brazilian co-author, Felipe Lauritsen, who I work with, obviously suggesting distracting alternatives like some tiny little fund that isn't regulated, and then using pressure tactics and exit threats. And pressure tactics and exit threats are what we will expect to see more of over the coming years. And so I'm going to talk about that. Wanted to just give a little update that from Australia, because I'm not sure if we have any Australians on the panel. In December 2024, the Australian government proposed a news media bargaining incentive, which would replace the code. And the idea was that platforms that didn't want to pay compensation under the code could instead pay a tax. And what was so clever is that the tax would actually be more than the code. So the idea was to really push people to just pay the code. And I think the Australian government was hoping that this would bring in more platforms like TikTok, because only Google and Meta had been covered originally by the code. So we had actually, we've been looking for a while at digital levy, so I can talk more about it. I know it's something that South Africa has thought about and that Brazil is talking about. And what I just wanted to flag was that Australia is going to have elections fairly soon, or they're going to election period. And Prime Minister Albanese has not, we weren't sure how much they would push for this, but immediately as soon as Trump got into office, they told the Australians, drop it immediately. It will affect your tariffs. It will affect our trade negotiations. And they even made threats like they would triple the taxes on Australians living in the US and Australian businesses, which is completely illegal. But I'm pretty sure that the same kinds of hardball tactics have been happening in Canada. Taylor would know more than I would about this. And of course, the Lobbying Association for the tech companies made an official complaint on March 11th and said that these new laws are coercive and discriminatory. And they also objected to some of the Australian requirements to fund local content and restrictions on self-preferencing and use of data, and have called on Australia to drop the levy. So the Australian government has told many other governments around the world over the last 5 years what the pressure from the platforms is like. And I think this seems like we're in a new era of even more pressure. Taylor already mentioned in the US, when California had a similar bargaining code bill, Google said they would test dropping news, which they also did, I think, in Illinois. So it's the usual, as I always say, it's like the mafia guy that comes to your store and says, nice little store, it would be really sad if something happened to it. So that's basically what they've been doing. And Oregon still is looking at, here's a little list of who in the US is still thinking about some kind of bargaining code. So Oregon, Washington State, New York, and Illinois. And then I just want to step back because I really thought, I wrote about this in December, that digital levies might become the sort of global replacement for the bargaining codes. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background. And I know I only have about 8 minutes, so I'll try not to go on too long. But many of you know, because you're journalists, that the problem of international corporate taxation and tax avoidance is a fight that has been going on for decades. And also, many of you remember things like the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers. And the OECD came up with a plan, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, for agreeing on a corporate minimum tax and then making sure that it was actually paid. And the US did what it often does, which is throw lawyers at these negotiations, drag them out for years, and in the end, walk away from them. And during this time, many countries had digital taxes or had considered them. And the US sent Janet Yellen around the world and said to all these countries, drop these taxes because soon we're going to have a global agreement. And some countries did, and some countries didn't. So my prediction is that as the bargaining codes get killed by many places and US trade agreements break down around the world, more and more countries will go back to these digital taxes. So I think this is something that we're going to see in the future. And I think that's going to be significant for all of us who are thinking about platform compensation, because the question will be, can we do what Australia has been tried to do, which is use the taxes as a way of getting people to pay the bargaining codes? Can we use it to help pay for local content? So we have to actually kind of know about this. I think, again, another point that may seem removed but isn't, is that the WTO is basically dead. Under the new administration, bilateral agreements are going to be the way that trade negotiations work. We've been there before. We know what that means. That means that the US will continue pressuring countries as much as possible. You saw J.D. Vance go to the Action Summit in Paris and say, get rid of all your tech regulation. So this is where the US is going to be. It scares people. In game theory economics, we have a lot of theory terms, the madman theory. And the madman theory is whoever's the craziest, most unpredictable person gets what they want. It's like why your crazy sister who might get mad at you, you say, okay, fine, I'll just do it. Or North Korea, people say, okay, whatever, I don't want to get you upset. So this is what the US is doing, is playing the madman. The uncertainty is getting people terrified. So Australia is probably not moving ahead with their levies right now. We know that collective bargaining is, if anything's going to work, Michael said this many times, it's going to be collective bargaining. We also know that appeasement doesn't work. So my advice and this is really, I'll just finish, I have one more slide, is that I think just like the EU has to lean into their own defense, the rest of the world has to lean into the fact that the US is going to be either absent from negotiations or making them much, much worse. This is the time when all of you, as we've talked about for the last 2 days, need to focus on what your countries can do in collaboration with other countries. I would argue that the EU has a lot to offer because, of course, they've done the competition authorities have acted against Google multiple times. I agree with Natalia's comment yesterday that local context will continue to matter and the movement for tax justice will continue. And I'm going to make a couple more points. One is all this discussion about what do we do, what do we do, what we do. There's two choices. You regulate or you build your own thing. That's it, folks. It's like when everyone used to argue about content moderation. We don't want government, we don't want private sector. That's all you got. So you regulate or you build your own thing or you do both. There are no other options, right? I think that in terms of regulations, there's tons of interesting things that can be done. My husband, for example, thinks that these companies should pay $1 billion bond before they're allowed to operate in any country. They don't like paying their fines? Great. Give us $1 billion before you open up in Brazil or in Indonesia. Then the other point you can also do, and I think Brazil has talked about this, is a requirement to have an office. Put an office, somebody who might. And then finally, what I want to say is that we know that one of the ways they scare people is the exit threat, which we saw already in Canada. And we saw it happen. So there's a couple things you have to remember. One is exit isn't actually economically a rational decision because they're making so much money that even if they pay, they're still making money. So it's not actually rational. Then you have to ask, the Taylor question, which is, do higher payments for news cause a reduction in news content on platforms? Probably not, maybe. And then finally, nature abhors a vacuum. So the global South technology may fill the void. May take a while for South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil to get it together. If they do, fantastic. And if not, you've got China. Not saying these are great options. I'm saying realistically where we're at right now.
Thanks so much, Anya. I can't wait for the discussion. Next up, I'd like to invite Camille Grenier from the Forum on Information and Democracy to give his remarks.
Thank you so much. I think Anya just said basically everything I wanted to say. So you made my 8 minutes a lot harder. Thank you so much. I think we all share at least three things in this room. First, that we care about the future of journalism and its sustainability. We all agree that we are in a critical moment. I've lost count of the number of times I heard or said that myself. And last thing I think we all agree is that Brazil has come as a unique space really to have this sort of debate with the G20 presidency last year, with all the work that the government has been doing on information integrity, on ensuring the sustainability of journalism. And I think this is a first thing we can work on collectively, is also supporting these people from within government who are doing the work and who are giving us these spaces where we can then advocate for change. And I know that, I don't know if Joao is here, he must be somewhere, but Joao Brandt, who has been really playing an important role in this debate, not only in the national stage, but also globally with the G20, with everything he's been doing. And really, I think that us as civil society, as researchers, we can really support these reformers internally in the government, in different governments, who are doing the work. So I will try not to history of bargaining codes, but maybe just give you back 3 dates from our perspective. First is 2021, then there's July 2023, of course, and finally 25. In 2021, we had this working group on the sustainability of journalism, Rasmus Nielsen, chaired by Rasmus Nielsen, the former director of the Reuters Institute at Oxford. And I remember perfectly the discussions we had back then. It was, to the question, should big tech pay for news? And basically, the answer, first, the answer was yes. But then the second is this working? Yes, sort of. And I think we ended up having the two options that Anya described. Either we go for bargaining codes or we go for taxation. we were back in 2021, and at that time there was still a lot of uncertainty on whether the bargaining code and the Australian example will be working. Is it only going to benefit to News Corp and the Murdoch Empire, or is it also going to benefit to independent local news outlet in Australia? So we went with the other option. I remember discussion saying, well, yes, let's tax them hard and use that money to support independent journalism. Fast forward to July 2023, we all gathered in Johannesburg, and I feel that in the room there was a better sense of optimism at the time, at least better than today. And we really, we had this discussion. I remember discussion with Anya and Courtney on, well, the evidence shows that there is some positive impact of the bargaining code, and that if we are to advocate for duplicating these codes in other countries, in other environments, we need the principles that were crafted back then. 2025. Here we are, the AI Action Summit. This is how the year started for some of us. And indeed, this speech from the Vice President of the United States basically saying, well, don't try to regulate. And then the attack of Trump Media and Rumble on Minister de Moraes here in Brazil. We wrote a piece with a researcher from HTV, Yasmin Kurzi, on this being really a warning shot for any other jurisdiction that will try to pass or implement regulation, as if you do this, you will have either legal cases or you will have these tariff trades that we've been promised. Where does that leave us? It is a complicated discussions, and I think indeed, as Anya just said, the taxation discussion is coming back really, and we'll be working on this very soon. But I think we also need to make sure that we adapt the framework and the corporations that to really bring about change. It's still important to argue, and the argument for regulation is very much important, but Erin, we were talking about that on what kind of new frameworks and new projects we can work together on. I think the Global Media Trust is, for example, one of these examples on how we can work together and how we can have some common negotiations with tech companies. And as Taylor said, the AI discussion is going to be the next, or already the next frontier. Talking about a little bit before I conclude, just a few words about the European and the French context, but that was also in Anya's slide, so I'm really feeling like I'm repeating what you said. But really what we see is that back in 2019, European Directive on Copyright, it got implemented in most national contexts, including in France. We've seen the first fines to Google, notably, but we still see this sort of a lack of cooperation and this sort of division within the journalistic sector and the media sector. And I witnessed a discussion between Mediapart, a journalist from Mediapart, independent investigative media house, and the CEO of Le Monde. And the journalist from Mediapart really told or asked the CEO of Le Monde, well, why didn't you gather us and coordinated with us before you went to OpenAI? And really the answer was like, look, I'm running a business, and at the end of the month, I need to pay the bills and I need to pay journalists, and I see a business opportunity, so I go for it. And I think that, finding the frameworks, then again, so that we ensure that these kind of frameworks and these kind of deals can benefit to the broader community is going to be essential. One last word about what we can do. As some of you know, the Forum on Information and Democracy is the implementing entity of an international partnership for information and democracy that has been endorsed by 55 countries around the world. And in this last few months, we've been thinking really carefully about what's next for this international initiative and what can we still do within this sort of multilateralist environment. We have a lot of discussion with the G20 and how we can pursue this discussion. But also, I think it's important to be more targeted and take the discussion within the umbrella concept of information integrity be really targeted on addressing some specific issues to really build healthier information ecosystem. So we have this discussion on media sustainability. We need to have a discussion on private messaging systems and how we ensure information integrity there. We need to have a specific discussion on, and that will be the case in Brasilia next week, on information integrity on climate change. I think that taking these pieces, we can really bring together also other communities, and we need to have like the climate change activists taking care and being involved in these discussions. We need to have the gender activists in these discussions, because we are all impacted by the healthiness of the health of the information ecosystem. So I really hope and I feel that there is more and more recognition from a lot of different groups that we need to ensure media sustainability and information integrity. I really hope that this is going to be the path forward for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Next, I'd like to invite Nolutan Dujukazi, who is a senior analyst and case manager at the Competition Commission of South Africa. Many people have referenced your presentation already over the past 2 days, so please take it away.
Thank you. Yes, many people have referenced our report, and I'm really glad that I'm on this panel here today, because we've spoken to Anya all through our processes in compiling this report, and I completely agree with what she's saying. I think, in terms of media sustainability, in terms of taxation, we considered that that's going to be one of our remedies that we're looking into in terms of the MDPMI. But very quickly, I just want to then just discuss, the background of our inquiry, how it started, and really what we looked into in terms of the findings and some of the remedies that speak to fair compensation and fair pay. So, compensation for us was not only about looking at short-term financial support or cash injection for the media, but also looking at it in the long term. So we created remedies that really would help media sustainability, this media diversity and plurality in terms of our media landscape. So the inquiry itself was started because the PSS, which is a bunch of media organizations, came to the Competition Commission because they saw that a regulatory framework was a better position to go for in terms of how to be able to get tech companies, digital platforms to be able to pay for news. And so for us, we considered this because we not only looked at it as a complaint investigation, but we also looked at it in terms of an inquiry. We built this entire inquiry so that we can be able to look at the entire ecosystem and how we can create remedies so that we can, we can regulate the entire ecosystem. So we drew a lot of our findings and our remedies from other jurisdictions. Taylor was talking about some of the unintended consequences that happen with Meta, and this was a consideration for us as well in looking at some of these remedies. But also we wanted to look at inclusivity. Some of the unintended consequences about the media bargaining code in Australia was that, a lot of the media that got compensated were large media. And so for us, smaller media is important, in terms of diversity, media plurality, and the sustainability of the media in South Africa. So our scope was pretty wide. It was really ambitious. We looked at radio and TV broadcasters. We included the public broadcaster, as well as the impact of AI chatbots, AI-powered search, and ad tech in the ad tech industry. So really, our remedies were really about restoring balance in the digital ecosystem, as I said, ensuring new sustainability over the long term with the diversity of culture and languages and media plurality. So I'm just going to speak to what, some of the remedies that speak to compensation. So we found that Google benefits from news content, as we all know, and news queries really in South Africa constitutes about 10 to 15% of total queries. And this amounts to about 800 to 900 million rand, which is about 45 to 50 US dollars in terms of, Google's benefit to news media. And news content is crucial for search beyond just ad revenue, but it also enhances authority and user engagement. It also drives personalized feeds like Google Discover and supports commercial search. So we also understood the symbiotic relationship between media and the drive for news distribution on these platforms. So we saw that news media gets about 200 million rand annually in terms of the benefit of the distribution. But we also saw that the algorithms divert traffic from South African media, causing about this 160 to 280 million rand losses in zero-click searches. So ultimately, we came to a number that where we think that Google should compensate news media between 300 to 500 million rand annually in the next 3 to 5 years. But this is short term, like I said. Our long-term solutions in terms of our compensation was really about behavioral changes. How do digital platforms sustain? How will media sustain themselves in the long term with digital platforms? So we called for in the remedies, we called for algorithm transparency and neutrality. One of the key findings in the inquiry is that Google's algorithm biases foreign media over South African media, as well as YouTube hosted content. And so the self-preferencing on YouTube, this algorithm biases then called for us to ask for this algorithm transparency and neutrality from Google. And in fixing this, we wanted Google to then change in its behavior in terms of promoting South African vernacular and community media in its search rankings, but also to ensure neutrality in content ranking so that South African news media and sources are unfairly deprioritized on the search page. But secondly, we also called for social media behavior as well. So we proposed that social media restore organic traffic to news media. Over time, social media, we understood that it deprioritized news, as we've all seen, forcing South African media to pay for visibility when it was organic, right? And this particularly hurt smaller independent publishers that rely on social media, as we heard from Kate earlier today. So in order for Facebook or X to restore this organic visibility, the remedy is to restore organic visibility to pre-2018 levels, and to reverse the suppression of posts with links, allowing publishers to drive their own traffic and revenue. And thirdly, we called for regulation. We also called for data sharing as well. So, I mean, we know data is key, and news publishers have limited access to their audience insights. And so big tech collects and monetizes this content. And so to level the playing field, we propose that platforms should be required to share anonymized audience data with publishers, allow them to understand readership trends, and enable better monetization strategies by equipping media houses with insights needed to optimize their digital advertising revenue. And then lastly, we recognize the need for legislative framework. So we wanted to ensure fair and transparent revenue sharing models. And so we proposed exemptions for the media for mandatory revenue sharing agreements. The Commission will exempt news media to negotiate payments for the use of content, especially for AI models. And then specifically on taxation and tariff and levies around on digital advertising. So we called for taxation and tariff and levies, about a 30% taxation on revenue generated advertising in South Africa, and a portion of those funds we are calling for to be allocated to support public interest journalism and local sustainability. So really, we looked at both short-term and long-term, and we considered what happened in Australia. We considered what happened jurisdictionally in terms of the unintended consequences, and this is what our provisional report looks like. As everybody has been saying in the past couple of days, it is a halftime. So we're waiting to see how digital platforms are going to react to these remedies, and we're looking forward to the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final panelist before we begin the discussion is Carla Igdil, who is a lawyer with a background in law and social sciences, and is with Azure and leads partnerships for Azure in government relations.
Bom dia a todo mundo. Acho que a gente está muito feliz de estar aqui nessa mesa e é um desafio trazer um pouco da realidade brasileira, que é sempre tão complexa. Eu vou tentar dividir essa fala em dois momentos, falar da perspectiva regulatória e desse debate aqui no Brasil, como ele é influenciado pelo que está acontecendo fora e como é que foram esses últimos anos, mas também tentar apontar um pouco para o que talvez a gente tenha de desafios e oportunidades para esse próximo período. Acho que é bom falar por último, porque vocês já anteciparam algumas das coisas, e acho que é muito bom a gente ter essa linha do tempo e entender como essa linha do tempo chegou no Brasil também. O debate de compensação, ele chega no Brasil muito influenciado pela discussão da Austrália. Então, o ano de 2023 foi um ano em que a gente debateu muito possibilidades de compensação, mas sempre baseado no modelo australiano. E o que eu estou dizendo isso? Porque a gente estava falando de negociação direta. Quando o tema é levado para um projeto, e aí a gente tem um outro problema se somando a isso, que é o fato de que a gente não tem uma agenda do jornalismo propriamente dita. O que a gente tem foi uma janela de oportunidade, o Chico falou bastante disso hoje cedo, a gente tinha ali uma janela de oportunidade desse tema, esse tema entrou dentro de um projeto que tentava regular transparência, responsabilidade e liberdade em algumas plataformas digitais, e aí esse tema entra com uma perspectiva de remunerar. Só que a gente tinha um desafio muito grande nesse momento, que era entender remunerar quem, remunerar como, remunerar por quê e quem paga. E aí acho que é importante a gente fazer um parênteses aqui para explicar para quem não vem do contexto brasileiro, que a gente tem muita dificuldade aqui em dizer quem vai receber, porque nós não temos uma legislação dura o suficiente, robusta o suficiente para dizer quem é ou não jornalismo, o que é ou não jornalismo. E essa é uma discussão que outros países não passam, porque é uma discussão sobre quem seria beneficiário. Então, é todo e qualquer conteúdo que está disponível numa plataforma digital que ia ser suscetível. E aí tinha uma outra pergunta, é toda e qualquer plataforma digital que tem que pagar por esse conteúdo? E como vai pagar? E vai pagar só pelo clique? Então, a gente está entendendo que é só a quantidade do tráfego que gera, que remunera. Esse foi um desafio muito grande, acho que teve um movimento de articulação muito importante nesse momento, de algumas organizações do campo do jornalismo, de procurar organizações dos direitos digitais, dialogar e tentar construir uma agenda que fosse mais próxima, para que a gente entendesse quais eram os riscos do projeto como um todo, entendesse quais eram as oportunidades para a nossa agenda. A gente também trabalhou muito dentro das organizações de jornalismo, e aqui eu queria dizer da parceria da JOR com a Repórteres Sem Fronteiras, com a FENAGE, para tentar trazer esse olhar mais amplo de organizações jornalísticas, jornalistas, e uma proposta que desse conta da diversidade, da pluralidade do nosso campo. Esse foi um debate que a janela de oportunidade se fechou antes da gente conseguir avançar com o projeto, e colocou uma outra oportunidade na mesa, que era a gente parar de atender a essa oportunidade que foi aberta por outros setores para discutir negociação direta e apresentar o que a gente queria para o campo. E acho que esse é sempre um desafio, o que a gente quer de fato para o campo. E aí a FENAGE tinha já uma proposta de CID, de política pública, de fundo público, e a gente passou esses últimos períodos discutindo esse modelo de taxação. E acho que isso tem muito a ver com a discussão fora do país, porque à medida em que os contratos na Austrália começaram a ter problemas também, essa possibilidade de não haver contratos, toda a discussão no Canadá, toda a discussão na África do Sul, a discussão no Brasil foi muito influenciada por isso tudo e a gente começou a apostar muito mais no modelo de taxa. E quando a gente fala no modelo de taxa, a gente ainda tem alguns desses desafios que estavam na negociação direta vindo para a discussão de taxa. Quem vai receber? Se for um fundo, quem vai receber? Vai receber como? Né? Quais são as linhas de distribuição desse recurso? Quem paga? E paga pelo quê? E qual é o valor? E essa discussão que a Ania trouxe antes, de ficar discutindo sempre qual é o percentual, a gente está sempre correndo atrás de discutir qual é o percentual, qual a melhor alíquota, a partir de qual cálculo. E é muito difícil avançar a discussão a partir disso. Acho que a gente vive agora um momento, no começo desse ano, em 2025, um momento em que a perspectiva de aprovação de uma CID, da criação de um fundo público de fomento ao jornalismo, é muito difícil. Acho que a gente tem fatores externos e internos para isso. A conjuntura política internacional mudou, a conjuntura nacional também mudou. Mudou influenciada por isso e mudou porque a gente agora está na última metade do governo. A gente tem desafios também pensando que teria uma janela de tempo muito curta para efetivar isso, tem que passar pelo Congresso, tem que conseguir aprovar, e demanda uma articulação muito grande. Eu acho que o cenário mudou e está muito difícil da gente avançar com essa pauta. Talvez a discussão de regulação de IA seja o que a gente consiga, nesse período, ainda avançar. Mas eu não queria parar a discussão em remamos e não chegamos em lugar nenhum. Eu acho que esse processo todo ele trouxe muitos aprendizados e muitas questões sobre aonde a gente quer chegar. Acho que a gente aprendeu muito sobre conseguir fazer uma aliança com outros setores que não só o do jornalismo, como o setor dos direitos digitais. Acho que a gente aprendeu muito sobre olhar para o jornalismo e tentar entender quais são as possibilidades de estratégias. Mas acho que a gente também aprendeu muito sobre a gente precisa de uma agenda para o jornalismo, e uma agenda de curto, de médio e de longo prazo. Não adianta a gente estar sempre trabalhando na lógica de janela de oportunidade. Óbvio que o trabalho de incidência política e o trabalho de aprovação de lei, ele está sempre vinculado a isso. Quando a janela abre, a gente tem que estar pronto para isso. Mas a gente não tem um debate amplo no campo e maduro o suficiente no campo para a gente saber qual é o nosso texto máximo, qual é o nosso texto mínimo. Quando a gente vai negociar, o que é inegociável para nós e o que é possível de ter essa margem. E eu acho que a gente precisa aproveitar esse momento para fazer essa reflexão, e fazer essa reflexão com todos os setores. A gente precisa fazer essa reflexão com as organizações jornalísticas. E aí aqui eu queria pontuar que são todas as organizações jornalísticas. A gente tem que discutir com o jornalismo local qual é a melhor forma de financiar. A gente tem que discutir numa abertura mais ampla e não sempre os mesmos na mesa. Acho que a gente também tem que discutir com a academia, porque muito disso precisa ser feito a partir de produção de conhecimento, e a gente precisa apresentar propostas de políticas públicas, e eu estou falando no plural, porque acho que a solução não é uma só, mas propostas de políticas públicas baseadas em dados e evidências. Para isso, a gente precisa produzir dados e evidências. A gente tem uma falta de produção de dados socioeconômicos sobre o nosso campo, dados sobre o uso de tecnologia sobre o nosso campo e dados sobre o próprio campo. Quando eu digo que a gente tem um desafio no Brasil, porque a gente não tem esse conceito do que é jornalismo e quem são os beneficiários, bom, vamos enfrentar? Acho que está na hora da gente enfrentar como fazer isso, quais são quem seriam os beneficiários dessas políticas públicas e como incluir mais gente nisso. Acho que, como o Chico disse, a gente não quer voltar para o passado, a gente quer construir outra coisa. E o que é essa outra coisa? E aí queria terminar um pouco com a nossa perspectiva bem pessoal da JOR, que a gente acha que um jeito de fazer isso é dialogando muito. Então, a gente tem tentado construir as nossas estratégias a partir de muito diálogo com as outras organizações, mas também sempre se nutrindo do diálogo com as nossas associadas, porque são elas que estão construindo novas audiências, entendendo e inovando no jornalismo diariamente, e estão enfrentando a desinformação no contexto do território. A gente é um país que tem 5.000 municípios. Então, entender como isso funciona numa dimensão grande como é o Brasil é muito importante. Eu queria tentar que a gente terminasse essa discussão sobre compensação, não numa chave de a oportunidade passou, Mas o que a gente faz para se preparar quando a gente tiver a nova oportunidade? E como a gente abre a nova oportunidade? Será que a gente não pode abrir a janela de oportunidade? Será que a gente tem que sempre esperar que ela ocorra? Era isso.
Thank you all. Thank you, Carla. At this point, I'd like to open up. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I know this was very dense content and it's after lunch, but I would like to open up if anyone has questions. Are there mics that are gonna? Okay, great. I saw you. Go ahead first.
So thanks everyone for their insights. My question is for Anja, but it's in relationship also with Carla said at the end, and it's about these bilateral agreements for payment. You mentioned that in Australia, this is the most common figure right now for the agreements. And I was wondering that, well, it's kind of cruel to imagine the journalist associations make fair agreements with big tech companies, which are even more big than and have more power than some countries. So in that scenario, what should be the conditions to make these agreements more fair or to mitigate the difference of power in these agreements? And with that question, do you think who should be the intermediary in these agreements? Somebody from the state, somebody from an independent organization outside the country? And last question with these two is, do you think that it will be possible or it will be positive if we have minimum payments? Minimum payments in the agreement.
I'm gonna hold so until we can get another question. If we can, no, don't turn off the mic, please. Sorry, just leave it on. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to ask a question in Spanish. No problem. Sorry, Anya. Es para Anya. No, quería preguntar por el estado actual de la ley de preservación del periodismo en California, si nos podrías contar cómo ha sido no sé si ya se está implementando o todavía no. Y recién preguntaban por los intermediarios, creo que hay, en ese caso, el intermediario, no sé si es una universidad, si recuerdo bien lo que leí, quería que nos cuentes eso. Y a Carla preguntarle también por, bueno, hoy si existe algún proyecto en el Congreso brasilero en particular, y bueno, ¿por qué lado va de todos los que comentaste? Gracias.
Thank you for the question about fairness. The idea behind the bargaining code in Australia was that the negotiations couldn't really be fair because, just as you say, there's large tech companies against publishers. So what Australia did was they said, you two sides come to an agreement, and if you can't, then there will be arbitration and the government will appoint the arbitrator. So that was to help the publishers. And they also said your arbitration has to be final offer arbitration, which the Australians like and use a lot. And the idea is that you cannot have Google saying to a publisher, I owe you $100, and the publisher says, you owe me 10,000, and it goes on for years. The idea is that by forcing people to come in straight away with the final offer, it will be a more fair discussion. In Australia, they never had to use this law, this arbitration, because everybody made the agreements. Now, by the time Michael got us all together in South Africa, and thank you to all the funders in the room, we all saw that precisely there were the kinds of problems that you were talking about. And that was when we approved these Johannesburg principles, which we started drafting at Columbia, do you remember? To talk about precisely all of these points of how to make it fair, how to make sure it was inclusive, how to make sure it was transparent. So I think a lot of us feel that Canada was an improvement over Australia, but still more to be done on fairness. As for what happened in California, it's a terrible story because in the end, the governor, who would probably like to run for president one day, vetoed the bill. So it is dead as far as I know. Courtney may have more up-to-date information, but that was when I sort of got disillusioned. But as mentioned, Oregon and Washington State and some other states are still talking about their own versions. Thank you.
Oi. Andres, obrigada pela pergunta sobre os PLs, que acho que acabei não comentando isso. A gente começou essa discussão toda com um projeto que era esse de a lei de responsabilidade, transparência e liberdade na internet, que era o projeto 2630. Depois, num momento de tentar tirar alguns temas desse texto para ter mais chance de passar, o tema do jornalismo foi para um outro projeto, que era o projeto 2330, mas ele foi junto com uma parte sobre os direitos autorais de artistas, uma outra discussão sobre streaming. Nesse momento também não foi possível chegar em um acordo, chegou perto, mas não foi possível chegar num acordo, também essa discussão, a gente perdeu o timing. Aí a gente foi para um terceiro projeto, 1354, esse é só do jornalismo. Esse avançou um pouco mais, ainda está no estágio inicial de tramitação, mas avançou um pouco mais. Esse projeto é específico de compensação no modelo de negociação direta, com algumas possibilidades de negociação coletiva, algumas incidências que a gente conseguiu de fato fazer, mas é um texto de negociação direta. A gente também tem uma discussão sobre CID posta. A gente tem uma proposta de projeto de lei, não é um projeto de lei ainda, que é a da FENAGE, que acho que é a mais completa, com um modelo de taxa, criação de um fundo, um comitê gestor e os mecanismos de distribuição. Também existem projetos na Câmara hoje que falam da criação de taxas, de CIDs para o campo digital, mas não falam especificamente sobre o jornalismo ou falam sobre vários temas, incluindo o jornalismo. Acho que a gente precisa entender um pouco mais qual desses projetos vai ter tração para, de fato, ser aprovado e quais são os projetos que a gente quer tentar dar tração, porque acho que é sempre essa a discussão, que a gente saia de um polo mais reativo, de sempre o contexto se cria e a gente vai no que tem mais chance e pensa o que a gente quer. Então, talvez o caminho seja um projeto de CID mais amplo, que tenha o jornalismo também, ou talvez seja um outro projeto, que é um projeto mais específico de jornalismo. Mas acho que essa é uma conversa longa, a gente pode continuar. Obrigada.
Oi.
Thank you. I just want to make one intervention to this question of fairness and minimum thresholds. I'm so sad because one of our speakers who was going to come, Karen Rond from the Denmark CMO, she is literally working and representing nearly all media in Denmark, specifically on licensing, and they have a very unique model around this. I think that we will hopefully try to get her to record her presentation. She couldn't make it because she fell ill, but perhaps we can record the session and then share it around online after. But yes, please, Chico.
A minha pergunta tem em vista um contexto que está acontecendo aqui no Brasil também, que é a discussão de uma regulação econômica ex ante de plataformas, em especial de ou mudar algo na legislação de defesa da concorrência, ou enfim, algo nesse caminho, né? A gente está discutindo isso e a minha pergunta vai para Nolutando e para Carla. Para Nolutando, o que eu gostaria de saber olhando para o caso que vocês estão trabalhando, o que seria bom se estivesse em uma regulação ex ante? Ou o que seria bom se tivesse como capacidade instalada no regulador da concorrência para regular mercados digitais e que tem a ver com casos que envolvem o jornalismo e a comunicação? Porque essas regulações econômicas elas vão se aplicar para tudo, para o iFood, Uber e tal, e para o jornalismo também, né? Então, nesse caso, o que esse caso ensina que a gente poderia ter construído em legislação e que a gente pode aprender para colocar no nosso debate aqui? E para Carla, o que você imagina que pode ser uma pauta para o campo do jornalismo nesse debate, não necessariamente pensando em fusões né, ou monopólio só, mas principalmente em condutas anticompetitivas. Então, o que vocês entendem que é uma conduta anticompetitiva que deveria ser vedada ou que deveria ser regulada num projeto como esse?
Thank you for that question. Yes. So I think in terms of just capacitating regulation and competition authorities, with us, for example, in 2018, we amended our act to include market inquiries, or market studies is what it's called. And this has helped us to be able to not only just look at abuse of dominance cases reactively, but to be proactive in how we look at some of the, especially digital markets, looking at how we can be proactive in setting up new legislation or regulation in terms of competition law. So this amendment in the Act allowed us to have more powers, first of all, binding powers in terms of some remedial action, and in order for us to look at how digital platforms will in future affect different economies. It's obviously known to all of us how AI and tech companies are having an impact in all aspects of our lives. We previously had an online intermediation platforms market inquiry. So this is not the first time we're looking into digital markets. And this amendment in the Act has allowed us to look further into different aspects of how digital platforms or tech companies affect different areas. So the intermediation platforms market inquiry looked at e-commerce, it looked at travel and accommodation, it looked at online marketplace, and different app stores, food delivery and things like that. And so it wasn't just this inquiry where we looked at how digital platforms affect journalism and media, but we also used this market study impact to look at different areas of how digital platforms impact every area of our lives. So I think in terms of effectively having regulation or effectively having a good antitrust authority, it's good to look into how market studies can assist and empowering market studies to have more binding recommendations or more binding remedies to be able to be effective in how to remedy these digital markets.
Great. And Carla?
Pergunta difícil, Chico. Eu diria que assim, acho que o campo jornalístico tem tentado nos últimos anos se aproximar mais do direito digital e talvez em alguns pontos tenha se apropriado mais do tema. Eu acho que o tema de direito econômico e concorrencial é um campo em aberto para a gente. Eu acho que a gente precisa se aprofundar, estudar mais e construir a nossa agenda para esse campo também. Então, a minha primeira resposta é: eu não acho que isso está dado, eu acho que isso precisa ser construído. Mas tentando responder, eu acho que tem alguns mecanismos que a gente precisa entender como é que funcionam, e eu espero que a gente consiga, que esse projeto olhe para isso também, que é a possibilidade de entender como a distribuição de conteúdo funciona. Porque talvez a lógica de concorrencial para nós tenha que estar aí, diminuir a opacidade sobre os mecanismos de distribuição. Não só no sentido de aferir a audiência, mas entender como essa audiência é construída, como chega, por que chega. E, a partir daí, tentar construir estratégias de uma divisão de conteúdo, de uma distribuição de conteúdo um pouco mais equânime. Eu acho que a gente deveria olhar um pouco para isso com mais atenção. Mas acho que tem outras coisas que a gente poderia tentar olhar, até das possibilidades de negociação coletiva, como a gente se constrói enquanto campo, que é uma das questões que foram levantadas na África do Sul, né, de que pode negociar todo mundo junto e isso não é cartel. Acho que essa é uma discussão central do direito concorrencial. Não acho que está no cenário brasileiro negociar todo mundo junto numa mesma agenda, mas a gente está seguro de que isso não seria visto de uma maneira negativa, de que isso não seria encaixado como uma lógica de cartel. Essa foi uma das demandas que foram discutidas na África do Sul e que a comissão disse diretamente, não é cartel, vocês podem fazer isso. Essa é uma das agendas que está sendo feita na Dinamarca. Então, acho que a gente tentar entender um pouco quais são essas agendas, mas eu iria no caminho de a gente precisa avançar nessa agenda de concorrencial e jornalismo. A agenda não está pronta.
Thank you. So I was given a reprieve, so I can have one more question. So we'll pass that to Courtney over here, and then we'll close the session and let you all caffeinate.
Thank you. So 2 small questions. One, for Tondo and the South African Competition Commission, it seemed like you made a special effort to get information not only domestically, but also from outside experts. So we submitted several times to the inquiry. And one of the things that we heard in the United States from our Department of Justice is how hard it is for them to get independent research that is not somehow funded or done through an organization that receives tech company funding. And I was wondering if you had any comments about whether that you feel that dynamic, whether you look at the funding sources of the information coming in. And one of the things about the Denmark case is they have managed to get all of the publishers together, 99% of them, and pushed back on OpenAI scraping. They lots of things that have happened. So I wanted to hear from Carla in Brazil, what are some of the challenges of getting the media to work together and ideally, more importantly, across coalitions. Like in the UK, they did this big Make It Fair campaign where all of the newspapers put Make It Fair about the AI copyright consultation on their front pages, in addition to hearing artists and musicians and actors speaking out about this. Do you think there's potential for that sort of solidarity here in Brazil?
Thank you, Courtney, for that question. So in the long and short of it is no, we didn't have that issue in South Africa. I think we base a lot of our powers on the Competition Act. We have powers to summon if we don't get information from platforms or from stakeholders. And specifically, as I mentioned in the earlier question, we have binding recommendations and binding remedies with this new market amendment to the 2018 Act. So that allows us to call for confidential information. It allows us to call for every type of information that we can think of, but also we're able to coordinate with other government departments. So very early on in our investigations, we speak to other government departments that may have any influence in that specific sector, so that we can get that information from them as well. So we really don't have that problem because we use our powers from the Act to summon information, confidential information from every stakeholder that we're looking into. So yeah.
And Carla?
Eu acho que há 2 camadas para essa sua resposta. Acho que a primeira é do ponto de vista de associações de jornalismo. Eu acho que a gente vem construindo uma possibilidade de diálogo melhor. O projeto de inteligência artificial, aqui a gente conseguiu construir uma frente, acho que não é bem uma coalizão, não foi tão formal, de atuação conjunta, primeiro com o setor dos artistas. E aí acho que é importante a gente lembrar que o setor dos artistas não é um bloco. Você tem diferentes categorias ali que dialogam mais ou menos entre si, e que foi um exercício muito longo no tempo, foram quase 6 meses para a gente conseguir de fato dialogar em 35 organizações, todo mundo junto, construir documentos juntos e se posicionar coletivamente com pedidos específicos, porque tem isso também, quando você chega no Congresso você tem que ter pedidos específicos, o que você quer, e ali tem muita divergência. A gente conseguiu construir isso com o campo dos artistas, E a gente conseguiu construir isso nessa primeira camada, que são as associações de jornalismo. E aí queria só pontuar que esse evento também foi construído coletivamente, no sentido de que a gente tem como parceiros institucionais associações jornalísticas. Não é trivial isso, é um esforço e um resultado de um momento de compreensão de que a agenda só vai funcionar se a gente caminhar junto. Mas eu acho que a gente ainda não chegou no ponto dessa outra camada que no Reino Unido está acontecendo, e acho que é tão importante da gente estudar, trocar essa experiência, entender o que está acontecendo, como isso foi construído, para tentar fazer aqui, que é do ponto de vista das organizações jornalísticas, porque aí os interesses são muito diversos, a gente tem um ecossistema muito diverso, e acho que a gente ainda não conseguiu caminhar no sentido de levar essa parceria, essa atuação conjunta, essa construção pelo menos de uma atuação estratégica, pontual, conjunta, das associações para as organizações jornalísticas. Acho que esse é o nosso desafio para esse ano.
Thank you. One more point.
Yes, one more point for Courtney. Just another added layer to in terms of jurisdictionally, if we've had any issues outside of our jurisdiction, for example. So, Michael was mentioning earlier how we have the Commission has powers to summon information for businesses that have an effect in South Africa. But jurisdictionally, if we're having issues, for example, in other countries, we have a lot of MOUs and bilateral agreements with other competition authorities. We're part of a lot of networks as well, like the ACF and the ICN. So if there are any issues that we face jurisdictionally in terms of if we get information or we can't get information from a specific company that's in another jurisdiction, then we can use those MOUs and those bilateral agreements to get that information. So that's an added layer to it as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to our amazing panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.